myths, legends. And the real Crusades. The Crusades have generated more myths than almost any other medieval conflict. Some are based on real events. Others are exaggerated, and some were invented centuries later. One of the most famous myths concerns Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. Popular stories portray them as almost friendly rivals, two noble warriors who respected each other deeply. There was certainly mutual respect between their political abilities, but the romantic image is largely a product of later storytelling. Their relationship was fundamentally strategic. Another famous legend concerns Saladin himself. He is often portrayed as an almost flawless gentleman, and compared with many medieval rulers, Saladin did demonstrate remarkable political discipline, but he was still a medieval military ruler. His career included sieges, executions, political struggles, and warfare. The real Saladin was more complicated than the legend. Another myth concerns the idea that the Crusades were simply Europeans invading a peaceful Muslim world. The reality was far more complicated. The Middle East was already politically fragmented. Muslim rulers fought other Muslim rulers. Christian rulers fought other Christian rulers. Byzantines fought Western Europeans. Alliances changed constantly. Religious identity mattered enormously, but political survival mattered too. There were even periods when Christian and Muslim rulers cooperated against enemies of their own. This is one of the most important things to understand about the Crusades. The medieval world was not divided into two perfectly organized sides. It was a constantly shifting network of alliances. Another famous myth concerns the Templars. Modern stories claim they discovered enormous secret treasures beneath the Temple Mount. Others connect them with the Holy Grail. There is no convincing historical evidence for these claims. The real Templars were interesting enough without the mythology. They were soldiers, monks, administrators, landowners, and financial managers. Another misconception concerns medieval technology. People sometimes imagine crusader armies as simple groups of heavily armored knights. But a crusading army contained thousands of people who were not knights. Blacksmiths, carpenters, merchants, engineers, cooks, doctors, priests, women and children also traveled with some expeditions. Armies were enormous moving communities, and without their support systems, the knights could not fight. One of the most remarkable aspects of crusading warfare was logistics. An army marching from France toward Jerusalem needed food, water, animals, weapons, replacement equipment, ships, money, information. The distance itself was an enemy. The Crusaders had to cross mountains, rivers, deserts, and hostile territory. Many died without ever fighting a major battle. Disease could kill more soldiers than swords. Heat could destroy an army. Lack of water could be fatal. The sea was equally dangerous. Ships were vulnerable to storms. Navigation was primitive by modern standards, and supply fleets could disappear. Another fascinating myth is the idea that Crusaders immediately understood the geography of the Holy Land. They did not. Maps were often inaccurate. Travelers relied on local guides. Ancient geographical ideas mixed with religious traditions. Some places were identified more by biblical memory than by precise geography. And yet these imperfect maps helped people travel thousands of kilometers. Perhaps the most powerful myth is that the Crusades ended when Acre fell in 1291. Politically, the Crusader states were gone, but crusading ideology continued. European rulers continued discussing new expeditions. Military orders remained active. The Mediterranean remained a frontier between competing powers, and soon another empire would rise, the Ottoman Turks. Their expansion would create a new era of conflict between Christian Europe and Muslim powers. In many ways, the Crusades were not the beginning of that story, and they were not the end. They were one chapter in a much longer history. The human cost of holy war behind every castle and famous king were ordinary people, and they experienced the Crusades very differently. For a knight, the crusade might mean adventure. For a merchant, it could mean profit. For a priest, it could mean fulfilling a religious duty. But for a farmer living near a battlefield, it could mean losing everything. Villages could be burned, crops destroyed, animals stolen, families separated, cities besieged. Sieges were especially brutal. When an army surrounded a city, the defenders could be trapped for months. Food prices increased, disease spread, water became scarce, people starved, and attackers faced the same dangers. This is why medieval sieges were often psychological wars. The goal was not always to storm the walls. Sometimes it was to make the defenders surrender. The sight of siege towers approaching could be enough. The smell of dead animals and corpses around the walls could destroy morale. Messages were sometimes launched over walls using siege engines. Propaganda was already part of warfare. The Crusades also changed the architecture of the Eastern Mediterranean. Castles became larger, walls became thicker, towers became more sophisticated. Defensive systems were adapted to new weapons. One of the best examples is Crag des Chevaliers. The fortress dominated important routes through Syria. Its walls were designed to absorb attacks. Its towers provided overlapping fields of fire. Its position allowed defenders to monitor surrounding territory. But castles were not invincible. Large armies could surround them. Supplies could be cut, and political isolation could be fatal. The Crusader states also transformed cities. Acre became one of the most important ports. Merchants from Italy, the Levant, and Europe met there. Different languages could be heard in the streets. Christian churches stood near Muslim neighborhoods. Jewish communities existed in the same broader commercial world. This does not mean everyone lived peacefully. Violence was frequent, but cultural interaction was unavoidable. Food changed, trade changed, language changed, medical knowledge moved between societies. European travelers encountered technologies and products that were unfamiliar to them. Sugar became increasingly valuable. Spices entered European markets. Textiles and dyes traveled west. Ideas about medicine and mathematics moved across linguistic boundaries. The Crusades therefore produced an unexpected contradiction. They were wars of religious division, but they also increased contact. One world encountered another, sometimes through violence, sometimes through trade, sometimes through diplomacy, and sometimes through simple curiosity. The legacy was not purely positive. The violence against Jewish communities during the First Crusade left deep scars. The massacre of Jerusalem remained a symbol of religious brutality. The destruction of Constantinople damaged the Byzantine world permanently. And the conquest of Muslim territories created generations of resentment. The Crusades also shaped European memory. Medieval chroniclers often interpreted victories as divine intervention. Defeats were explained as punishment for sin. Legends grew rapidly. Holy relics became objects of enormous importance. The true cross, the holy lance, sacred stones, fragments of bones. Some were authentic, some were questionable, some were almost certainly invented, but their psychological power was real. A soldier could fight differently if he believed God was on his side. And this is perhaps the most important lesson of the Crusades. People do not fight only for territory. They fight for meanings, for identity, for faith, for revenge, for glory, for family, for money, for political power. The Crusades combined all of these motivations. That is why they lasted so long, and why their memory survived for centuries after the armies disappeared. The end of the Crusader states by the late 13th century. The Crusader presence in the Middle East was shrinking rapidly. The great castles remained, the walls remained, but the political system that supported them was collapsing. The Mamluks were methodically destroying the remaining Crusader strongholds. Antioch had already fallen in 1268. Tripoli fell in 1289. Acre remained. It was the last major symbol of the Crusader project. Inside the city were soldiers from different European regions, knights from military orders, merchants, refugees, local Christians, people who understood that the city might be their final refuge. In 1291, the Mamluk army arrived. The siege was massive. The defenders knew they were outnumbered. The Mamluks attacked the walls with siege engines. The fighting became desperate. Eventually, the defenses collapsed. Acre fell. The remaining coastal settlements quickly followed. The Crusader states had disappeared. For Europeans, this was not simply a military defeat. It was the end of an entire political experiment. For almost 200 years, Western European rulers had attempted to maintain permanent territories. In the Eastern Mediterranean, they had created kingdoms, built castles, founded military orders, established trading colonies, and fought generation after generation. But geography had always been against them. Their enemies lived nearby. Their strongest supporters lived thousands of kilometers away. European politics repeatedly distracted potential reinforcements. Kings died. Civil wars erupted. Succession disputes consumed resources. The Crusaders were never able to create a permanently united European state in the region. After Acre, new crusades were proposed. Some plans were surprisingly ambitious. European thinkers imagined attacking Egypt. Others dreamed of conquering North Africa. Some even discussed routes through the Mongol territories. But enthusiasm was fading. Europe had changed. The political map was becoming more centralized. Kings were increasingly focused on their own territories. The age of the great medieval crusading expeditions was coming to an end, but the military orders survived. The Hospitallers eventually established themselves on Rhodes. Later they moved to Malta. They continued fighting Muslim naval powers for centuries. The Templars, however, disappeared. Their suppression created a cloud of mystery that still surrounds them. Some stories claim they cursed the French king. Others say their treasure was secretly transported to Scotland. Some connect them with secret societies. None of these stories has strong historical evidence. The truth is less mysterious. The Templars had become politically inconvenient. King Philip IV of France owed enormous debts. The order was wealthy. The king accused the Templars of heresy and other crimes. Many confessions were extracted under torture. The organization was eventually dissolved. Its leaders were executed. Its assets were redistributed. The medieval crusades had become history, but the idea of crusading did not completely disappear. Europe would continue fighting wars against Muslim powers, and in the 14th and 15th centuries, the Ottoman Turks would become increasingly powerful. They conquered Byzantine territories, they expanded into the Balkans, and eventually they surrounded Constantinople. The city that had once welcomed the First Crusade would become the target of another great Muslim conquest. In 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II. The Byzantine Empire ended. The irony was extraordinary. The First Crusade had been launched partly because Byzantium feared the Turkish advance. The Fourth Crusade had then devastated Constantinople, and more than 2 centuries later, the city finally fell to the Ottomans. The Crusades had failed to permanently secure the Holy Land, but they had changed the Mediterranean forever. The legacy of the Crusades ended centuries ago, but their consequences remain visible. Walk through Jerusalem, visit Acre, stand among the ruins of Antioch, explore the castles of Syria, look at the walls of Constantinople. The medieval world has not completely disappeared. Its stones remain, but the most important legacy is not architectural, it is cultural. The Crusades changed how Europe imagined the Middle East. They changed how Christian Europe imagined Islam. They changed how Muslim societies remembered Europe, and they influenced political identities for centuries. But the story is more complicated than a simple clash between East and West. The Crusades connected worlds that had previously been separated by distance. Merchants traveled, scholars traveled, pilgrims traveled, technologies traveled, languages mixed, ideas crossed borders. Even warfare produced cultural exchange. European soldiers encountered sophisticated cities. Muslim scholars encountered European military methods. Byzantine engineers influenced Crusader construction. Italian merchants created permanent commercial networks. The Mediterranean became more interconnected. One of the greatest misconceptions is that the Crusades directly created the Renaissance. The reality is much more complicated. The Renaissance had many causes, but contact between Europe and the wider Mediterranean world certainly contributed to the movement of texts, knowledge, and goods. Arabic translations preserved and transmitted important works of ancient philosophy. Mathematical concepts traveled across cultures. Medical texts were translated. Astronomical knowledge circulated. The world became more connected. Another important legacy was the development of military institutions. The Templars and Hospitallers demonstrated how religious organizations could operate enormous international networks. They owned property in multiple kingdoms. They maintained castles. They transported money. They organized soldiers. They communicated across vast distances. In many ways, they were early examples of organizations that operated across borders. But the Crusades also left a darker legacy. Religious violence became associated with divine justification. Massacres could be described as sacred victories. Entire populations could be portrayed as enemies of God. This mentality did not disappear with the Middle Ages. The memory of the Crusades continued to influence later conflicts. Centuries later, politicians, writers, and religious leaders would reinterpret the Crusades to support their own agendas. The medieval wars became symbols. For some, they represented heroic defense of Christianity. For others, they represented European aggression. For historians, they represent something more complicated, a mixture of religion, politics, economics, fear, ambition, culture, and human desperation. The Crusades were not inevitable. They were created by particular circumstances. The Byzantine Empire was under pressure. The Seljuks were expanding. Western European rulers wanted influence. The papacy wanted greater authority. Knights sought land and prestige. Pilgrims wanted access to sacred places. Merchants saw opportunity. and ordinary people believed they were participating in something larger than themselves. That combination created an explosion. The First Crusade captured Jerusalem, but the victory created a political problem that could never truly be solved. How could a small population from Western Europe permanently control distant territories, surrounded by much larger powers? The answer was never found. The Crusader states survived for nearly 2 centuries. Sometimes they expanded, sometimes they nearly disappeared. They experienced victories, defeats, treaties, betrayals, alliances, and extraordinary personalities. Saladin, Richard the Lionheart, Frederick Barbarossa, Baybars, Alexios Komnenos, Pope Urban II, and countless less famous people whose names have disappeared from history. Their lives were shaped by a world very different from ours. Yet their fears were familiar. They feared losing their homes. They wanted security. They sought wealth. They believed in causes greater than themselves. They wanted glory. And sometimes they simply wanted to survive. The Crusades, therefore, should not be remembered as one simple war. They were a chain of conflicts stretching across generations. They were fought in Jerusalem, Antioch, Acre, Damascus, Anatolia, Egypt, Constantinople, Iberia, the Baltic, and even within Europe itself. They involved Christians fighting Muslims, Christians fighting Christians, Muslims fighting Muslims, kings fighting rivals, merchants exploiting opportunities, and ordinary people caught between them all. The final lesson of the Crusades is perhaps the simplest. History rarely fits into 2 sides. There were no perfectly good armies, no perfectly evil civilizations, no single cause, no single consequence. The medieval Mediterranean was a world of competing ambitions, and the Crusades were one of the most dramatic expressions of that struggle. The armies are gone, the castles are ruins, the banners have turned to dust, but the cities remain. Jerusalem remains, Constantinople remains, Acre remains, and the questions raised by the Crusades remain as well. What happens when religion becomes intertwined with political power? What happens when distant peoples meet through violence? Can enemies become trading partners? Can political alliances overcome religious divisions? And perhaps most importantly, how can a war fought in the name of something sacred produce such profound human suffering? More than 9 centuries after the First Crusade, those questions still matter. Because the Crusades were never only about the medieval world. They were about human beings, and that is why their story has never truly ended.